So first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone here to tonight's webinar. My name is Shireen Asden, and I'm a member of SAJFP, which is the South African Jews for a Free Palestine, and we are the organization who's hosting the meeting. Just by way of introductions, Jews, the SAJFP feel compelled to speak out against the actions of the state of Israel. And we also feel compelled to speak out because of our national identity as South Africans. Many of us were active during the anti-apartheid era and have experienced and contributed towards South Africa's journey towards a just and democratic post-apartheid state. And we hope that we are able to contribute similarly to the struggle for a free Palestine. So that is by way of introduction to SAJFP. And also before starting the webinar, I think it's appropriate that we acknowledge what is currently happening in Gaza. According to the Ministry of Health, over 33 people have been killed, including 6 children, because of the bombing of the Israeli army of Gaza. And apparently over 250 people are injured. This is the information that we have currently. There is speak of an imminent ceasefire, but nothing seems, from the news that we are receiving now, to have been concluded. So this is the context for the discussion today. Is there's a greater war in the state of Israel, in historic Palestine, and that Israel continues to behave with impunity, disregarding the lives of Palestinians. And this leads us into the webinar today, which is to focus on a very specific breach of international law, one of the many breaches of international law that Israel continues to defy. And speaking with us today, we have 3 very we appreciate very much our 3 speakers. We are going to start off with Aninka Claasens. I have never met Aninka personally, but I know her name, as many of us older South Africans will know. Her name is very much synonymous with the fight against forced removals in South Africa during the apartheid era. So Aninka is a veteran land activist, and she supported communities resisting forced removal and farm evictions in the 80s. She was responsible for, as an expert advisor on the issue of property rights in the lead up to the pre-1996 constitutional negotiations. She headed the Land Right Project at the Center for Applied Legal Studies at Wits, and played a central role in developing post-apartheid land laws and policies. She was an advisor to the Minister of Land Affairs during the Mandela presidency. She's involved in a range of litigations challenging government interventions and laws that have ironically undermined and continue to undermine in post-apartheid South Africa the hard-fought gains in relation to land rights and equality for women. She also founded the Land and Accountability Research Centre at the University of Cape Town, which supports rural communities resisting ongoing processes of dispossession and autocratic forms of chiefly power. So welcome, Aninka. I think that you are really well placed to introduce us to the issue of forced removals and the lessons that we can learn from the South African experience. So thank you, Aninka. Over to you.
Thanks, Shireen. I'm going to go straight into a PowerPoint. So if I can share my screen, then I can put up the PowerPoint.
You should be able to share your screen, Aninka.
Okay, all right. Okay, share, and then, okay, and then.
You play from start.
Play from start.
Right. Yeah.
What's some horrible thing about language?
Okay, just click off that. Don't just cancel.
Okay, and then I play from start.
Yes, but you must go to above that.
Yeah.
Is play from start.
Play from start. I just see slideshow. Okay, all right. Well, let's hopefully that will. Okay, can you see that?
We
The whole
can
thing.
see it, yes.
Fine. So basically, just to kind of outline that 3.5 million people were forcibly removed in South Africa between 1950 and 1990, out of a population at that time of 28 million people. There were different kinds of removals. There was the so-called black spot removals, which were mainly African landowners. Then there were lots of removals from white-owned farms, and then there were urban removals. And the rationale was the cleansing of white South Africa, of black Africans, and also of colored and Indian people. And Africans in particular, through the process of forced removals, were stripped of their South African citizenship and consigned to ethnically delineated and fragmented homelands, which were designed to become independent states. And Coloureds and Indians were delegated to their own so-called group areas out of the common shared cities. Okay, now how do I go to the next one? And that really what one's got to understand is the intrinsic linkage between the denial of people's property rights and the denial of their citizenship rights and their decision-making authority. And basically all Africans were designated to one or other homeland, even where they had no familial links with people living in the homelands. That those homelands were based, that really go back to British colonialism. They're based on the reserves that were created during British colonialism. And they're minute fragmented areas of land, which were initially that 7% of South Africa set aside by the 1913 Land Act. Now, because the majority of the population was consigned to 7% of the country, they had de facto established land rights in the rest of South Africa. So the Land Act, hundreds of thousands of groups of African people had managed to purchase land in what was white South Africa, and they then faced forced removals from so-called black spots. Millions of South Africans lived on the white-owned land as labor tenants and sharecroppers who had been on that land before whites arrived, and many hundreds of thousands of South Africans were removed from urban areas where they had had permits or leases. Now, this whole process of forced removals was set out in law, but it was done through processes of direct and structural violence. So the black spot removals were the removals of the people who had title to land. They were fiercely resisted. Government brought in bulldozers, arrested people, people were killed, and they were removed to resettlement camps, which were tent camps, or a symbol that was very familiar to all of us in the 80s, these fields and fields of tin toilets in the veld, waiting for people who were being forcibly removed. The removals resulted in starvation, deaths of children. Operation Hunger was formed basically to deal with the starvation that followed forced removal. At the same time, you had farm evictions, which actually started much earlier. They started in 1913 with the Land Act, and Sol Plaatje evocatively describes how people who had previously been living on those farms as labor tenants or as sharecroppers were evicted once it became illegal for blacks to either own or rent land in the, at that point, 93% of the land that was set aside for white ownership. And the eviction of people from farms was particularly brutal because they were evicted in swathes as various edicts were issued in terms of the 1936 Act, but they were evicted by white farmers, seemingly privately, and given no alternative land or transport as to where they were meant to go to. In the urban areas, you had group areas evictions where people were removed from the common parts of the towns and the cities to areas designated for Coloureds or Indians or Africans. But you also had a lot of removals that were called squatter removals and those didn't provide any alternatives or any accommodation. And then the other form of forced removal, which was ubiquitous and affected people every single day, was the pass laws, which limited the rights of all Black South Africans to be in the cities unless they could prove they had Section 10, 1, A, B, or C rights. And it kept migrant laborers on a kind of contract where they perpetually had to go back, get a stamp from a chief in order to be allowed to come back on a 1-year contract. So there was this perpetual cycle of detention and arrest and deportation through the pass laws. So just to give you a pictorial view, here is a map created by the Black Sash, which shows some of the homelands in different colors. And those arrows are where people were removed from into those different homelands. So you had a kind of process of adding land to the initial 7% set aside by the Land Act to make it 13% as people were removed from common parts of South Africa. So these removals were sanctioned by the law. We had Section 10 of the Black Administration Act, and note that that went back to 1927, which allowed for the removal of any African tribe or from any area to any other area by decree of the state president. So very, very difficult to challenge forced removals when you have a law that explicitly allowed for them. And then you had the 1913 and 36 Land Acts, which prohibited all these forms of labor tenancy and sharecropping in white farming areas. You had the Group Areas Act, you had the pass laws, which governed influence control. And just as you had all these laws that were removing people out of the common South Africa, you had the homeland governments complicit in those people being incorporated into their so-called homelands, because people were removed onto land belonging to the South African Development Trust, still part of South Africa, and then that land full of people was incorporated into the homelands. And despite pressure on the homelands to reject those transfers of land and people, only one homeland leader refused to accept those forced removals, and that was Ines Mabuza of Kangwani. Buthelezi allowed it, Mangope allowed it. Well, they profited from it and completely rejected requests to stop this process from continuing. Now, there was a victory against forced removals in 1986 by the Driefontein and Kwangema communities in what was then the southeastern Transvaal, and government stopped the process of classic forced removals, but still tried to achieve the same ends by redrawing the boundaries of the homelands to incorporate those groups of people who were too strong and independent for them to be able to forcibly remove. Okay. Now, the consequences were terrible. The dispossession, which has proved to be irreversible despite the Restitution of Land Rights Act. There was the immediate suffering, the long-term intergenerational poverty that resulted. You had the breaking up of families and communities, the destruction of social capital and societal safety nets. With the forced removals, people lost their animals, they lost their equipment, and more than that, they lost their agricultural skills, so that people now meant to be able to go back to farmland don't have the kinds of skills that the people who were forcibly removed had. And what you've got is intractable and enduring spatial inequality. So here is a map of the former homelands, which I've put up really just to compare it with this next slide, which is a map of poverty. And this was done in 2011, so it's quite an old map, but it shows the areas of deepest poverty in South Africa, those being the dark brown areas. And that maps more or less exactly onto where the former homelands were. Now, this legacy has proved to be absolutely intractable. We've got a whole range of laws and policies starting in the early 2000s under the Mbeki presidency, which give traditional leaders sole decision-making power over all the people, the 18 million South Africans living in the former homelands. You had the 2003 Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act. You had the Communal Land Rights Act seeking to transfer title to all that land to traditional leaders. You had the 2008 Traditional Courts Bill, much resisted, which created two parallel legal systems, completely separate in South Africa, one for the former homelands governed by chiefs with extraordinary punitive powers, and then the other system of magistrates and different levels of courts for the rest of South Africa. Also strongly resisted and not yet law, but then the 2019 Traditional Khoisan Leadership Act was passed, which gives chiefs which entrenches their decision-making authority in respect of mining and investment deals in the former homelands, of which there have been a series of disastrous deals that continue the process of dispossession. So basically, although this is a brief snapshot of forced removals in South Africa, it's also a story of a kind of irreversible legacy that once that harm has been done and those people are stripped of their property rights and their citizenship rights, they somehow become invisible, even to a seemingly democratic government like ours. So that's my input, Shireen. I was meant to keep it quite brief, I think, because most of the discussion will be about the situation in Palestine.
Thank you, Aninka. I think it's hard for us to look back on our past and see just how entrenched the damage has been, even now in our democratic dispensation. And it makes one even more fearful for the consequences of what's happening in Palestine, and particularly now focusing on Masafer Yatta. And we are going to hand over to the next speaker, who is Asher Kirchner, who's been spending time in Masafer Yatta himself and is going to give us an appraisal of what is happening there now. Asher is a retired professor of linguistics at the University of Alberta, and he serves on the board of Temple Beth Ora, which is as well as on the Tikkun Olam committee of RJCC. RJCC is the Reformed Jewish Community of Canada, and Tikkun Olam is its social justice arm. Asher also serves on the National Steering Committee of Independent Jewish Voices of Canada. So welcome, Asher, and over to you.
Okay, sharing my screen now. And starting the slideshow. Okay, is the slideshow showing now?
Not yet, Asha.
Oh dear.
Yeah, I can see it.
No, it's not as a slideshow. And you've
I see
highlighted your title, so just
Yeah, okay, let me try again. Sorry, I had this problem before and I figured I found it, and now I'm trying to remember what that was. Okay, so now let's try.
that's fine. But you just click off that title, just put your cursor down and click. See if you can go to slideshow at the top.
Yeah.
The slideshow.
Stop share.
Oh, no. You could carry on sharing.
Just a second. I'm sorry about this.
No, it's fine. We tried it before, but until we'll get it there. Get there.
Start with.
So share screen, Asha. Okay, now go to slideshow. Yeah, start. There's it. Got it.
It's working now?
It is. It's in
Okay.
slideshow.
Okay. Good. Okay. Okay. First of all, I apologize for that, and I apologize also that my video camera seems not to be working this morning. Yeah, let me get started. And I'll just mention on top of remembering that today is the day that we are commemorating Tisha B'Av. It's actually the day after, but yesterday was Shabbat. So today is the day we remember Tisha B'Av, the destruction of the temple, and I think it's appropriate for us to remember that at a time when we're seeing demolitions once again in the land of Israel. So, after retirement a few years ago, I began a deep dive into Jewish learning and observance. And the more I learned, the more I was troubled by a certain disconnect. On one hand, the central message of Torah is one of justice and compassion. And this verse from Exodus is just one example. But on the other hand, I know that serious oppression of Palestinians has been done and continues to be done by the state of Israel, purporting to act in the name of the Jewish people, whom I'm a part of. I felt a responsibility to join with other Jews in standing up and speaking out clearly in support of human rights. When I heard about the Center for Jewish Nonviolence and their 3-month program of accompaniment of vulnerable Palestinians in the West Bank, I knew this was something I had to do. So from February to May of this year, I was a volunteer activist with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence's Project Hinenu, which means here we are in Hebrew, along with 5 other Jewish volunteers, Tommy, Maya, Zach, Sally, and Kate, and Tyler too. We were joined by one non-Jewish volunteer who came to Israel as an exchange student and got drawn into activism. We were supported by CJNV staff, Oriel and Claire. I was the only Canadian, the rest were American or dual American-Israeli citizens. They were all 20 or early 30-somethings, and I was the token altercocker of the group. Maya and Tommy were fluent in Arabic, others were more intermediate, while I was a near beginner, which was rather embarrassing for a linguistics professor, and I compensated by doing a lot of the cooking for the group, and so I earned the title of Rav Cook. No, not that Rav Cook, this one. Okay, we were hosted by and worked closely with a number of Palestinian activist partners. I'll just call your attention in this slide to Tariq Auda, whom I'll be mentioning later in the talk. And we stayed in 3 villages between the city of Yatta, which is south of Hebron, and the south edge of the West Bank, an area called Masafer Yatta, which means the agricultural lands of Yatta in Arabic. And here you see circled from right to left the villages of El Khair, Tuwani, and I've just circled one other village, Tuba, slightly to the south, which will figure in some of the stories I'll be telling you. We stayed in rudimentary dorm-style guest houses built by the villagers for international solidarity groups like us. In the middle, you can see me in a bunk bed in El Khair. The houses, for the most part, was rather makeshift, but this is how the Palestinians of the area have to build for their own homes as well. This is because the Israeli civil administration, which is actually not civilian, it's under military control, the ICA does not recognize these Palestinian villages and denies the residents building permits, and so any construction is deemed illegal and subject to demolition. The one exception is the village of Tuwani. Through superhuman organizing effort decades, Tuwani has been able to build a school, to connect to the electricity grid, and most amazingly, to get approval from the civil administration for a certain amount of residential building relatively protected from demolition. The house you see in the picture at the bottom right is in Tuwani, and you can see it has a solid wall and a stone staircase leading down to a courtyard. And I'm just gonna have to take a break for 1 second to let my dog out. Hang on. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so what did we do while we were there? First of all, we accompanied children from the town of Tuba to and from school in Tuwani. The road from Tuba to Tuwani passes by the extremist outpost settlement of Chavat Ma'on. And since its establishment in the late 1990s, grown men began attacking these school kids. International observers began accompanying the kids to protect them, and they were attacked too, some of them seriously injured. These attacks became so notorious that in the early 2000s, the government ordered the army to patrol every school day, morning and afternoon, to escort the kids past the settlement. That's been happening for the last 2 decades, at least in theory. But this army patrol sometimes shows up late or doesn't show up at all. And the whole time the kids are waiting, they're vulnerable to attack from settlers. In fact, that happened as recently as last December. Palestinian adults can't accompany the kids because it's illegal for them to be that close to the settlement. So there's still a need for international or Israeli adults to accompany the kids as well. And our Hinenu tour of duty. In the picture on the left, you see Oriel and Tommy playing soccer with some of the boys on a day when the army showed up several hours late. And here's another clip showing Saleh and Tommy waiting with the kids. Another big part of our work was accompaniment of Palestinian shepherds as they led their flocks of sheep and goats out to pasture. Some days were peaceful, but often, increasingly as winter gave way to spring, these shepherds would get harassed by settlers. Sometimes the settlers stole sheep, sometimes they injured the sheep, sometimes they tried to chase the shepherds off their land, sometimes settlers cut down their olive groves. Often settlers would graze their own flocks on Palestinian land. We would often call the army and/or ICA police when these criminal acts occurred. We left the decision whether to call or not up to the shepherds. Sometimes the authorities would respond, sometimes they didn't, but not once did they arrest a settler. If the authorities intervened at all, it was in the form of an order to both sides to leave the area and go home, striking a pose of neutrality, even though the Palestinians were on their own private land. Now, to give you some idea of what a settler attack looks like, I'm now going to show you a video clip of a confrontation between Palestinian shepherds from the village of Kharuba with settlers, again from the outpost of Chavat Ma'on. The brown-shirted guy, appropriately enough, is a settler. The guy in the baseball cap getting choked, however, is not a Palestinian. He's an Israeli activist named Itai, who often joined Hinenu in our accompaniment work. And you can hear his partner in Hebrew as she films the assault. At the end there, the settler grabbed Yasmin's camera away from her, which he then smashed on the ground. We also witnessed home demolitions. Now, I somehow didn't hang on to any of my own demolition images, so I'm using these images that I found online, but I can tell you that these images are pretty much what we saw. Our partner, Auda, summed up the situation they all live under. He and his family go to sleep every night, or not, they will still have a home to sleep in the following night. Imagine what it's like living with that threat hanging over your head constantly. We also documented the aftermath of a pogrom in Tuba last March. Settlers invaded the village and smashed the windows of all the cars. When we called the ICA police, they threatened to arrest us for wasting their time. We forwarded the evidence we collected each day to Israeli human rights organizations and to lawyers representing the Palestinians in land claim cases. Almost always, the shepherds we accompanied invited us to their homes afterwards for tea and sometimes for substantial meals, and they would not take no for an answer. The economy and the traditional way of life of these communities is built around shepherding, supplemented with a bit of olive cultivation. Indeed, this is the only independent livelihood available to these Palestinians. The occupation regime has systematically blocked other forms of economic development in the region. But we heard stories of shepherds who can keep fewer and fewer sheep as their grazing lands are taken away by settlement expansion bit by bit. My grandfather had 500 sheep, one shepherd told us, and I can barely feed 50. On the positive side, we formed deep relations of solidarity with our Palestinian activist partners. Here you see some of them again, as well as with the shepherds we accompanied and with the ordinary people of the villages where we stayed. For example, when Auda in El Khair heard that it was Zach's birthday, he quickly organized a grilled chicken feast to celebrate the occasion. Now, I'd never technology before, but in Yatta, there's a bakery that makes cakes with a custom image of the birthday boy or girl printed on the icing. Auda got a hold of this picture of Zach, apparently fleeing from a flock of killer sheep, and you know where this is going, right? So here's Zach with the resulting cake. At Maya's suggestion, we then did a toast or roast, going around the circle, offering good wishes to Zach, or sharing funny anecdotes about him. We had many such gatherings during our time there, with Palestinians, Jewish Israelis, and diaspora Jews all working, eating, laughing, and grieving together, with conversations weaving back and forth between English, Arabic, and Hebrew. Before these experiences, the word solidarity was just an abstract concept for me, but now it has real emotional content, beautiful and powerful. The Masafer Yatta area is overwhelmingly Muslim, and during the month of Ramadan, when Muslims fast from sunup to sundown, we shared many evening iftar meals with our Palestinian partners. The high point for me was the joint seder and iftar that we celebrated with them in El Khair. We bonded with our Palestinian partners over matzah ball soup and the Pesach message of liberation from oppression, a message they had no to. We closed the Seder singing Hine Matov. How good and pleasant it is for brothers and sisters to dwell together in unity, and that's exactly what we were doing. Well, those experiences were the pleasant side of solidarity. There were not so pleasant bits as well, of course. For example, we experienced repeated Israeli army night raids when we were staying in Tuwani, unprovoked by any violence or illegal activity, with no apparent purpose other than to intimidate and harass the residents. In one such raid, just a few hours after Zach's birthday party, in fact, soldiers tackled me to the ground and seized my video camera. You can see me in the video I'm about to show wearing a yellow cycling jacket. They struck Zach with rifle butts, bruising his forearms and shins.
Give him his phone. I'm with him. I'm with him. Go, let's go. Do not touch me. Do not touch me. Don't touch me. אני יהודי מארצות הברית. אני יהודי. Do not touch me. Do not touch that. No, I'm with him. I'm waiting for him. No, do not. Why? Because if I can't see you, I must think you're doing something that is illegal and I can shoot you. You can shoot me? Are you trying to shoot in America? הידיים שלו למעלה.
This is the line. Everyone can see the line. Everyone can see. I can see the line. I'm telling you, please go. No backward. No backward. There is operation in. Thank you. It's 2 in the morning and you're doing operation in our houses. They're doing stun grenades. Stun grenades.
Those were stun grenades at the end that the soldiers threw at us. But note how the soldiers prefaced their commands with please and thank you. Note how they threatened to shoot Zach, but didn't. Easy compared to how the army often treats Palestinians, particularly when there are no internationals around. Here's a clip of our partner, activist journalist getting beaten and kicked by soldiers while he was trying to film a demolition near Tuwani. This occurred a few days after the Hinenu group left the area. And trigger warning, this is quite disturbing to watch.
يا بدوي يا ابن القحبة
I have another story that is less violent. Time it's so over the top. I'll let the facts speak for themselves. One morning, we saw a convoy of Israeli army jeeps heading past Tuwani into the city of Yatta. Now, Yatta is Area A, which means it's supposed to be under the complete control of the Palestinian Authority. Of course, the Israeli occupation forces go into Area A whenever they have some ostensible military objective, but otherwise Israelis are supposed to stay out of Area A under Israeli law. Going on as we hadn't heard any news of any trouble in Yatta that might explain this army incursion, so we cautiously followed at a distance. The jeeps pulled up in front of Yatta's municipal swimming pool. The soldiers ordered all the Palestinians out of the pool area at gunpoint, and a few minutes later, 2 busloads of Jewish settlers arrived. The settlers were ushered into the pool area by the army. From where I was standing there, they seemed to be hearing some kind of lecture, and maybe they then did some swimming as well. I couldn't really see from where I was. They stayed for an hour or so, then they got back in their buses and left along with the army. The whole incident seemed so bizarre. When I told my wife back in Edmonton about it over the phone, she thought I was pulling her leg. That couldn't have actually happened, right? But we later learned that this settler occupation of the Yatta swimming pool happens every few years. So much for Palestinian autonomy in Area A. We saw and lived under an ugly reality that I'd guess few Israelis, let alone diaspora Jews, are even aware of. With these escalating settler attacks from their agricultural lands, the constant threat of home demolitions, the Palestinians of Masafer Yatta have endured a slow economic strangulation. The very last day of our stay in Masafer Yatta came the death blow. The army had designated much of the district as firing zone 918 back in the 1980s, supposedly as a military training area. The firing zone is marked on this map. Contemporary internal documents make clear that this decision was not about any real military need, but purely as a stratagem for getting control of Palestinian land. In 1999, the army expelled the residents, but the High Court then granted an interim injunction allowing them to return to their villages pending the case. That precarious state of affairs continued for over 2 decades. On Wednesday, May 4th, that final decision was announced. The High Court completely rejected the villagers' claim, asserting that the Palestinians who had lived there for generations, in some cases for centuries, were not in fact permanent residents. The court did not try to reconcile this expulsion with the Fourth Geneva Convention, to which Israel is a signatory, adopted in response to the Nazi atrocities of World War II, which expressly prohibits this sort of forced population transfer. Rather, the court simply ruled that in any conflict between Israeli military law and international law, Israeli law controls. Think for a moment about the implications of that stance. If I that in case of a conflict between the diet I'm supposed to be on and my desire to eat fattening desserts, the latter controls, I'm pretty much announcing that I've thrown off the constraints of my diet. So what does this High Court decision say about Israel's adherence to the constraints of human rights law moving forward? The army now has the green light to expel the villagers at a moment's notice. But somehow the Jewish settlements within the supposed firing zone are exempt from expulsion. You have to understand, these Palestinians are not just losing their homes. They are shepherds, dispossessed of their grazing land. They're losing their livelihoods as well. They're losing the networks of mutual aid that exists among long-term neighbors. And Aninka's presentation really brought out this fact in the case of the South African land expulsions, and it's going to be true here as well. So these people may have relatives and friends in Yatta, but Yatta does not have the capacity to absorb a disaster of this scale. In fact, this appears to be the largest mass expulsion of Palestinians by Israel since the 1967 war. Already, bulldozers have begun home demolitions, particularly in the southernmost villages closest to the Green Line. And in more recent days, I've read that the army has been stopping up wells, cutting water pipes, laying landmines, all to prevent villagers from attempting to return and rebuild. Not all of our Palestinian partners in Masafer Yatta are directly affected by this ruling. El Khair, Tuwani, and Susia are all outside the firing zone, but Tuba is inside it. The school kids we accompanied every day live inside that firing zone. Likewise, many of the shepherds we accompanied. And all of our partners have relatives and friends who live inside it as well. It's difficult to fathom how devastating this will be for the many Palestinian families who befriended our Hinenu group. Local Palestinian activists and Jewish allies have been putting their bodies on the line with direct action and protest in Masafer Yatta, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem to resist this expulsion. But without a strong international outcry, and here the outcry of diaspora Jews carries particular weight, it will be pretty easy for the army to crush this resistance, perhaps within the next couple of months. More ominously, this ruling paves the way for further expulsions. In 2019, the Netanyahu government announced a plan to annex much of the West Bank, but the international community reacted with alarm and the government had to back down. But this High Court decision arguably signals an intention to proceed with annexation, albeit in a lower manner. If the Masafer Yatta mass expulsion does not trigger a strong international outcry, we can expect these expulsions to ramp up into full-on ethnic cleansing, pushing Palestinians completely out of Area C, which is 61% of the West Bank, and concentrating them in ghettos in Area A, which is only 18%. We could call this the Gazification of the West Bank, or maybe the I urge you to learn more about the situation in Masafer Yatta by visiting the Save Masafer Yatta campaign website and following the hashtag on social media for action updates in the coming days. I also want to call your attention to an online news magazine, 972mag.com. Many of our Palestinian and Israeli partners publish articles there regularly. so you're getting reporting from people with firsthand experience of what they're writing about. Let me close with one more story. A large Jewish settlement called Carmel was established in the 1980s right next to al-Khair on land confiscated from the village. In the decades that followed, these settlers have brought down a steady barrage of army harassment and home demolitions on al-Khair. How do you imagine the Palestinians of al-Khair feel about these settlers? Our partner, activist and school teacher Tariq Al-Hathalin, remarked, "We'd be happy to live with these people as neighbors if they would just treat us like neighbors." I offer that comment as a typical example of attitudes I encountered. The Palestinians I met have no problem with Jews. They have no problem even with Israeli Jews who are prepared to treat them as equals. They have a problem with enforcement of Jewish supremacy at the expense of Palestinian human rights. This is why it drives me crazy when people wring their hands about the impossibility of peace there. Peace between Jews and Palestinians already exists in our own eyes. It's present in the relationships of deep trust and solidarity that have been forged between Palestinian and Jewish activists. If the powers that be would just sit back and make space for these nonviolent activists to do their work, I believe they could lead the rest of Israeli and Palestinian society into peace and security for everybody. Instead, the Israeli government singles out these very activists for punishment, as you saw with the beating of Bassel al-Adra. The Israeli activists are the object of smear campaigns, orchestrated by political figures and taken up by mainstream media in Israel, branding them as traitors. It seems the Israeli government, or whoever's in charge there, is attempting to destroy the grassroots leaders of Palestinian and Israeli, potentially bring peace to their land. Activist Yasmin Erenvardi writes that the policymakers seem to want to provoke Palestinian violence because each such episode feeds the right-wing narrative of fear and revenge, shoring up Jewish support for the oppressive apparatus of the occupation and for the right-wing politicians who champion it. The goal seems to be entrenchment of Jewish supremacy at any cost, Jewish lives at substantially greater risk. In recent decades, many of us in the diaspora Jewish community, I think, have been afraid to speak out about Palestinian human rights, as have the organizations that represent us, for fear of giving support to Israel's enemies, real or imagined. We need to rethink this. We need to look at what Israeli policy, as indicated by the Masafer Yatta, is heading. It is not Ahavat Yisrael to support a government that does such things. It is endangering Israel. I believe that the highest form of Ahavat Yisrael in this moment is to support the many courageous Jewish Israeli organizations like B'Tselem and Breaking the Silence, like Rav Arik Asherman's Torah, individuals like Yasmin and Itai, shown here, who are all working in various ways to resist this oppressive occupation regime, to stand in solidarity with Palestinian nonviolent activists for the greater peace and security of Jews and Palestinians. Thank you. That concludes my presentation. You're muted, Shireen.
Thank you, Asher, for that very deeply moving and personal account. And I think it's time to hand the mic over to Saleh Hihazi, who himself is a Palestinian living in Palestine. Saleh is the Africa coordinator of the BDS National Council. SAJFP is part of the International Global BDS Coalition. And prior to his current role with the BDS movement, Saleh was deputy director for the MENA region at Amnesty International, where he led the work on producing the organization's report on Israel's apartheid against Palestinians. I think many of us are very familiar with that report, which has been groundbreaking and I think has forefronted a lot of attention to the crisis in Palestine. Saleh is also a member of Al-Shabaka, which is the Palestinian Policy Network, and he holds a BA in Liberal Arts from Lawrence University and an MA in Human Rights from the University of Essex. So thank you, Saleh, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Shireen. Thanks all for attending, SAJFP for organizing. And thanks also to Aninka for the educating for an amazing, very informative and engaging presentation. I have to apologize. I'm not going to show anything visual, not as organized as the other panelists. And I wanted to do something. I'm going to be short anyways. I wanted to do something short and perhaps more engaging. But as Shireen was saying in the beginning, unfortunately, we've had another Israeli onslaught on Gaza over the weekend, and that has, well, been devastating on one hand, and but also kind of pushed us into thinking about the action that we here in Palestine, the BDS movement, but also working with other partners, can be doing right now. But to go back to Masafer Yatta, which is intrinsically linked to Gaza, which I'll come to that in my small intervention. Thanks to Asher, I mean, we have now a very good and very much felt picture about what is happening in Masafer Yatta, and it's been happening for a long time. Over decades, really. It became most visible, as Asher was saying, in Israel's announcement to annex further territory in the occupied West Bank. That was visualized in the Trump so-called deal of the century, the US president, previous President Trump, and most recently in the court decision. But the ethnic cleansing of the area has been going on for many decades. This is perhaps kind of the smaller context. The larger or medium context is the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and the establishment of the settlement enterprise, then the development of the settlements and the expansion of them. The objective is very clear. It's more land, less Palestinians. And this applies across the geography of historic Palestine. In Masafer Yatta, it's home demolitions, it's not granting permits to build homes or infrastructure or services. It's the settler violence that Asher was also describing. It's the army violence, whether directly, including during raids, or harassment, detention, preventing people from exercising their rights, or through, for example, military trainings and drills that are done in and around the communities. It is also depriving people of the ability to make a living and be able to remain steadfast and resilient on the land. But it's very also important to highlight. I mean, Masafer Yatta, it's important to keep the focus. It's important to continue the defense and the support, but it is not the only situation where people are threatened with ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, or even across in 1948 areas, like, for example, in Naqab. Smaller communities in these areas, usually semi-nomadic or semi-Bedouin, let's say, in terms of kind of the way of living in Area C, the Jordan Valley, the Southern Hebron Hills, in and around Nablus, or in the Naqab Desert. These are all small communities that are under imminent threat of ethnic cleansing. What is, I think, very important to understand, and this is coming kind of to the larger context, is that at the heart of Israel's settler colonial regime, which uses apartheid, and I'll come to think about the report I helped produce for Amnesty. It uses apartheid as a strategy, not only to segregate, but really to replace. Similar to, for example, what's happening in Masafer Yatta, pushing the Palestinians out to expand the settlements there. We've seen, for example, in Hiran, a community in Anaqab, just a few kilometers away from Masafer Yatta, where an entire Palestinian village was raised to make way for a Jewish town to be built using the same name, Hiran. Now, linking these communities together and to understand how they link together is to understand how Israel's apartheid system looks like and works. At the heart of the system is the intent to maintain Jewish-Israeli supremacy and hegemony, both in terms of demography and geography, meaning that majority, a Jewish majority with as much control of land as possible. Now, to do that, and this regime has been developed and put in place four main strategies. The first is to fragment Palestinian society into different geographic areas. The essential act of fragmentation was in Nakba, the word that Palestinians used to describe the events of 1947-48, where hundreds of thousands were forced out of their communities, homes, and villages to become refugees, and others have been murdered, including in massacres. So the fragmentation into different geographic areas. The second strategy is to segregate and control. And soon after 1948, the establishment of the state and the declaration in that establishment of the state of the intention to ensure Jewish supremacy, we've seen Palestinian communities segregated into different areas and having a military put under military control. Jews.
Sorry, Saleh, your internet's a bit disconnected. Can people just switch off their video maybe, and maybe it can get better? You were breaking up.
Hello? Is this better now? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah,
all right.
Much better. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, did you lose me?
You were breaking up very badly.
Okay. I was describing, and this is going back to the Amnesty's report on Israel's apartheid against Palestinians, which looks at apartheid in two ways. One as a cruel system of domination, and two as a crime against humanity. And I was describing that cruel system of domination and the four strategies since the establishment of the State of Israel that is pursued to ensure Jewish-Israeli hegemony, both in terms of demography and geography. I spoke a little bit about fragmentation, basically fragmenting Palestinian society into different geographic areas, to segregating those Palestinian communities and violently controlling them through military occupation or military rule. And the segregation is both in law, but also from the Jewish communities under the control of the state. The third strategy is dispossession, and it's a body of laws that Israel in the early 1950s has put in place, some of those building on colonial British laws or Ottoman laws that strip away Palestinians from their property, particularly land, including, for example, the absentee property law, which allows and actively used until today to take away the property of those who Israel forced out and became refugees. And the fourth strategy is deprivation, is ensuring that Palestinians always remain at a disadvantage socially and economically as compared to Jewish Israelis. This includes, for example, violations against the right to work, the right of movement, the right to cultivate land, to access land, and so on and so forth. Now, to maintain this regime of domination, the fragmentation, segregation, dispossession, and deprivation, Israel perpetrates crimes which have been very well documented over many years by human rights organizations, international, Israeli, and Palestinian, including also the United Nations. These crimes include the forceful transfer of Palestinians, basically the policies that push people out of their homes, whether it is through home demolitions, creation of coercive environments that force people to leave their communities and their homes, laws that strip away, for example, residency rights. This is, for example, particular to Jerusalem and the 1948 areas. So forced displacement is one of the crimes, and it is under international law in itself a crime against humanity that is carried out to maintain the system of oppression and domination. Two, it's the detention and torture, systematic torture of Palestinians. Three, the killing of Palestinians. And four, it's the persecution. It's a deprivation of civil and political rights. So these very well documented crimes are carried out to maintain this system of oppression and domination. So when you look at Masafer Yatta, and here Ash's also presentation was very informative, you see that there's a microcosm of Israel's apartheid. It is, you see how the communities are fragmented from the rest, for example, Yatta or the other communities around. Very important to remember that many of those people who are in the areas south of Hebron have also been forcibly moved or pushed out from the Naqab region. Many still have family relations to people who were there. This forced displacement also took place in and around the Nakba, but also afterwards in the early 1950s when all the Palestinian Bedouins in the Naqab were moved to an area triangle that was called the Siyaj, and many of them also were pushed across to the West Bank. So a fragmented community, segregated and violently controlled by the army, their lands taken away from them, on any way of being able to sustain themselves, make a living, and develop as a community. So all the four strategies you can see in these small communities. But there are also the crimes that are being perpetrated to also maintain that system, maintain the situation for what it is, and that is in Masafer Yatta very visibly, of course, the forced displacement, the home demolitions, but also, like, for example, in the case of Larda, it's the use of detention and torture, use of force against people who dare to stand up to this oppression. So Masafer Yatta is a microcosm, but so is Gaza. You know, it was very, this term of Gazification is I think, that Asher brought forward is very important to keep in mind here. The goal for both Masafer Yatta and Gaza is the same, is that you have maximum amount of land with less Palestinians. Now, in Masafer Yatta, Israel wants the land. In Gaza, this is land that Israel, perhaps for now, is content of not having, but wanting out because of the large Palestinian population there. Palestinians must remain fragmented, segregated, controlled, and without any power to resist in any of the areas, the fragments that they live. Differ perhaps from one fragment to another, but the Palestinian home is always in the crosshair. So the Gaza and how it links, it's because, Asher was saying that the intent is to push Palestinians out of these areas that Israel wants, with no Palestinians in them to areas like, for example, Area A in South Hebron is Yatta, and to impose really a Gaza situation on them, that if not the whole land without Palestinians, then most of the land, where Palestinians then are put into prison-like areas and conditions, and you work on decreasing the number in an incremental way. If you see what's been happening in Gaza over the last few days, but also kind of the main pattern that emerges when it comes to Israel's military attacks on the Gaza since 2008, all of which have taken place under a criminal blockade, which prevents basic movement of people and goods and services in and out of the strip. The main pattern that emerges from these military attacks has been to destroy people's homes. Many times with families still in those homes. So if you look at, including in this recent onslaught, where most people have been killed, it is when they were in or around close to their own homes. So it is this attack on a Palestinian home that links these two together. But I think it's also, and I'm coming to an end here, as much as it is important to understand and to expose and take action against Israel's apartheid, it's also equally important to see, recognize, and support Palestinian resistance. This resistance has been ongoing for decades, since 1948 and onwards, but it has been fragmented, and this reflects the fragmentation of society that Israel has imposed, but also, unfortunately, most importantly recently, the lack of Palestinian leadership, or the division of Palestinian leadership, to be able to link better these fragments. So today we see in Jenin a fight that is different from Jerusalem, which fights differently from the people in Gaza, which fights differently than the people in Masafer Yatta, and so on. What connects all is resilience, is that people are until now able to stay and are not going anywhere. And every now and again, an uprising. And very important here to highlight what has happened over the last few years, but specifically last year in May and June of 2021, when we've seen what was called the Unity Intifada, with an unprecedented expression of unity across all of historic Palestine. So, and I mean, what to do now when it comes to Masafer Yatta, but also all the other communities that are under the imminent threat of an ethnic cleansing in the Jordan Valley, in the Naqab, but also in response to Israel's onslaught on Gaza, is really to continue to fight for the narrative, is to expose Israel's apartheid and to highlight the Palestinian experience and to act in solidarity with it. More concretely, is to really work to end the government's complicity with Israel's apartheid. And one thing to highlight here, and I'm happy to come to all of those in the discussion, is to join and elevate the campaign for the UN to investigate Israel's apartheid. In September, there will be the UN General Assembly. This is when all states come to New York, and there'll be resolutions passed in relation to Israel and Palestine. And we from the BDS movement, along with partners in the human rights community and others, want the UN to investigate Israel's apartheid through the establishment of the Special Committee on Apartheid, which was there for South Africa since 1962. Also, the boycott, to elevate, develop, and make stronger boycott campaigns. Some of the strategic campaigns currently happening is the campaign to boycott HP, the computer and tech company, to boycott Puma, which sponsors Israel's sports washing, for AXA, the insurance company, to divest from Israel. And I think something to end with here in relation to South Africa is to stop the greenwashing, and particularly exposing the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. And this is in relation to recent news that came out where the JNF is funding an Israeli delegation to come to and work with South African municipalities to consult and address on the a clear example of greenwashing Israel's apartheid, and especially South Africa should not be a place for that. I'll end with this. Thanks very much for listening. I apologize for the bad line, and looking forward for the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Saleh, for contextualizing what is happening in Masafer Yatta, and also for joining the dots for us between our own horrific past in South Africa and what is happening in Palestine today. So at this point in the webinar, I'd like to open the floor to anyone who has questions or comments. I saw there was one hand raised. Jessica, can I ask you to come in at this point to moderate? Anyone with questions, please raise your hands or put them in the chat box, and we will try to get to as many as we can before closing.
Sure. Thank you, Shireen, and thanks to our speakers. So there was someone, Jonathan Sugarman, who wanted to speak. Had his hand up. Are you still here, Jonathan?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, first of all, I'm here as a member of the Irish Jewish Voice for Peace, and I'm extremely grateful for this webinar and for inviting us along. I'm a slightly peculiar creature insofar as my mom was born in Tsumeb, and I spent a lot of my holidays in Swakopmund and Windhoek. And hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
So this presentation was fascinating to me for a multitude of reasons, because unfortunately, I grew up in a very Zionist, pro-apartheid home in Israel. My mom was secretary to the South African ambassador in Tel Aviv in the late 70s, and later on the SABC reporter in Afrikaans. So it's been interesting. But firstly, I'd like to thank you for organizing this webinar. Secondly, I'd like to ask the permission of all your speakers to either share their slides or quote them. I was particularly touched, having spent 3 unfortunate years in the Israeli fascist army. Saleh's quote of "more land for less Palestinians" resonates very strongly with me. So I'd like everybody's permission to share your slides and share what you've stated this evening, because I'd like it to take it back to Jewish Voice for Peace Ireland and share it with my colleagues there. So is that all right with everybody?
Jonathan, I have no problem, but I'm not sure that's my quote. You're perhaps better quote Golda Meir, who said, you know, a land for people without a land, you know, just imagining some, yeah.
Saleh, I have to say that whereas the provenance of that saying is somewhat doubtful. What is not doubtful, unfortunately, is that one of the key people in enforcing the so-called civil administration of the occupied land of Palestine is the father of, the son of Dublin's chief rabbi, Rabbi Herzog, who became President Herzog, and earlier in his days in the 60s was a key person in implementing the most horrific racist laws in the occupied West Bank. And so, as an Irish Jew born in Israel with a mother from Tsumeb, unfortunately, I can relate. And it's
You've
very
got baggage.
Which is why, on a separate note, because I'm writing a book, attempting to write a book, I would appreciate it, if I could share the slides that were shared this evening with my colleagues in the Irish Jewish Voice for Peace. So if it's possible to email those to anybody of us, I'd be delighted to share that. Sorry?
Oh, I was just going to say maybe that we should take this offline.
Okay.
And you can share your email with us, and then we can arrange something offline.
With pleasure. I'd like that very much.
There might be others who want as well.
Because unfortunately, and I apologize for logging in late. I've had some internet difficulties. Aninka answered some questions for me this evening that I never got answers to as a teenager, coming and going from places like Cape Town, Swakopmund, Tsumeb, and a few other places. And these are not particularly pleasant answers.
Yeah. Okay, Jonathan, I'm going to move on to somebody else because we're running out of time.
May I just say one more thing? Saleh mentioned the absentee landlords, which is a horrific law that the Israeli parliament passed. I would be glad to share what I've written in English about another horrific measure by the Israeli government, which is of administrative detention, where there have been teenagers who have been kept in jail without ever seeing a judge.
Yeah.
And this is beyond horrific. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Are there other people who would like to speak? Maybe if you stop spotlighting, we can see if there are others. Oh. Okay, so I have a question. So what I've been thinking about is, I heard or read somewhere that Prime Minister Sharon, when he was the Prime Minister, he said that the idea of firing zones should be used as a way to make way for settlers, and in that way to settle the West Bank with Jewish Israelis or with Jews. Do you think that this is the strategy here? And I suppose I'm directing this at Saleh.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, what you're referencing is something I believe that Haaretz newspaper uncovered this year or previous year, but recently. But yes, absolutely. I mean, there are different.
Sorry, Saleh, you're breaking up again. Maybe take your...
For example, my own home, we have different, legal papers. I'm a citizen of Israel. My wife is a West Bank ID card holder. My father is a resident of Jerusalem. We all have different statuses and are treated differently. And different areas also, the different fragments are dealt with in different ways. So when it comes to Area C, it is the use of firing zones. It is where you say, all right, this is where the military is using to training. It's prohibited and dangerous for you to enter here. A very striking example is a community in the north of Jordan Valley called Humsa, where people are moved out of their home for a few days for the army to carry out drills, and then they're allowed to come back. So the army is saying, you know, we're not pushing you out, you stay here, but this is where we're training. Every now and then, we're gonna come and say, you know, move out, go, don't care where you go, because we have tanks that are gonna be rolling. But, you know, you can stay also, and the children can be living in the shacks because I don't allow you to build homes, because and see the tanks around. Another tactic is the use of, you know, and Asher was saying about, for example, settlers herding their own sheep or cattle, and we see this use more and more over actually the recent years. You know, the settlement strategies and tactics have been different. So instead of, you know, bringing in a number of settlers and establishing a base for them to provide electricity, where you have, for example, a few tents. Now you can have a family or a few, you know, young people settling on a hill with 2 or 3 cows or sheep, armed with the protection of the soldiers, and then they go around and demarcate the territory. And so if you have Palestinian herders in the area, they push them out. Or sometimes they say, you know, this is the boundary and you can't come in, decreasing more and more the land that Palestinians are able to use. In addition to the other, right? So not allowing building permits, demolishing the homes, not providing the infrastructure like the water, electricity, making it hard for people to reach to hospitals, clinics, schools, and then the direct violence that is coming from the settlers are all tactics, and the firing zones is one of them. But it's very important. Thanks, Jessica, for mentioning, because Sharon was honest about, you know, a number of things. So this was one. Another one was, for example, when he said that we should not, in reference to the law that is called the Entry to Israel law, which now has become a permanent law, not allowing Palestinians like myself to pass my legal status to my wife, because she's a Palestinian from the West Bank. Now this is permanent law. It was a temporary law from 2013 until 2021. And in commenting about the law, Sharon said, look, we don't, because there was a justification of security. He said, you know, quite clearly, we don't need to hide behind security reasons. This is very clearly for ensuring our interest in maintaining Jewish majority, demographic majority. And he's been honest about a number of things. I mean, in terms of intent of laws, policies, and practices, and this is where, you know, there was a lot of work that we've done when I was with Amnesty at documenting these expressions of the intent, whether it is through public statements to the media, in interviews with organizations, or in discussions in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, in and around the passing of discriminatory laws. If you look at the protocols, the discussions, all this intent of why these laws, whether relating to dispossession, whether relating to control, or other, are put there. It's very clear. The intent is very clear. It is to ensure Jewish supremacy in terms of both demography and geography in Palestine.
Thank you. Are there any?
If I could just add a couple of comments to Saleh.
Yeah. Thank you. Come in.
Those remarks of Ariel Sharon were from way before he became prime minister, going back, I think, to the late 70s or early 80s, which was well before the Oslo Accords and the Area A, B, and C system. So the architecture of this plan has been in place for a long time. And the only other thing I wanted to add to what he said was another device that the occupation regime uses to dispossess Palestinians is archaeological justification. So, for example, an article about so Palestinians in the Masafer Yatta area, traditionally, many of them lived in caves. And I read a story about a Palestinian in a cave, an Israeli archaeological inspector or something came and said, "This is an archaeological site. You can't you can't be living here. You can't change anything." And he said, "What do you mean? My grandfather dug this cave." But that shows the absurdity of it.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody else want to come in? I can't see.
Yeah, I'd like to come in. Shuri.
Thanks, Aninka.
Yeah. Just to say that, a classical symptom of forced removals in South Africa, the so-called black spot removals, where people had ownership, was to move them somewhere else. And it was people with lesser rights that simply got evicted without alternative. And it sounds from what I've been hearing this evening, as though in Palestine, that it sounds as though Israel doesn't bother to provide alternatives, that it's treating people with, well-established ownership rights. It's actually evicting them more than forcibly removing them, because forcibly removing is removing you from one place to another place. So in a way, I'm asking a question, is there also the kind of taking people from here to there, and however bad there is, at least it's a place in replacement? Or is it mainly just treating people as though they have no rights and basically chasing them out? So it's up to them to find another place and to find another way of getting there. So yeah, I'm asking that question, because if it is like that, then it's worse than forced removals, the classic kind of forced removals.
Saleh, are you coming in?
Yeah, I can come in. That it's absolutely that. There is no alternative that is provided by Israel. What you have is what Asher was referring to in terms of the division. For example, when it comes to the occupied West Bank without East Jerusalem, you have a division of the area into three. Area A, which is under Palestinian, supposedly, both security and civilian control, but it's really only civilian control because the Israeli military controls everything. Area B, where there's less authority for the Palestinians, but it's under Israel's security control. And then Area C, which is the largest part of the occupied West Bank. It is where these communities exist, but where settlements also are there and expanding. And this is where we see these policies really most visible and brutal in terms of the home demolitions and the creation. And I think this is very important as well. It's the two things at once. It's demolishing people's homes, but it's also the creation of these coercive environments, pushing them out. Where they go, Israel doesn't care. They can go to Area A, which are areas that are segregated and violently controlled, very, perhaps less of an oppressive reality than Gaza, but very similar to it. And going there, as Asher was saying, the gasification of these Area A. But that's not an alternative that is provided. You just go there and see, and better actually, you leave the area under Israel's control altogether. So it is that second one, Aninka, and also similar, when it comes to Gaza and here linking, because as I was saying, the most visible and destructive pattern is this attack on people's homes. It's a bringing down of buildings with hundreds of, for example, residential units. It's the attacking of, for example, refugee camps where people live in very, large families live in very small places. So like we've seen yesterday, for example, in Rafah, it's one of the cities south of the Gaza Strip. where you have one of the largest refugee camps in the occupied Palestinian territories. And of course, Gaza is if not the highest number of people living in the smallest area around the world. Rafah is particularly very populated, and the refugee camps. And so a targeting of one home can really take away a whole community. And those people lose their homes, right? Without also any alternative. So it's the intention here is really to, and what I was saying at the beginning in terms of the intent behind the settler colonial regime is a replacement, and it's not, this is not to say, that there was no replacement, or the logic of South Africa's apartheid, it was not also replacement. Of course, it was in many areas. But here you have, you don't have as much of a Palestinian majority as compared to the Jews. It's actually quite equal. And so in areas like Masafer Yatta and the Jordan Valley, in Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and others, is, the intent is to replace, is to completely remove the Palestinians for then Israelis choose to take.
For that question, Aninka. I see Jonathan wants to come in again. Quickly, Jonathan, okay?
Jonathan, you're muted.
Sorry, yes, please, if I may. To answer Aninka's question, on one of the times I spent in Belfast, I met a Palestinian student who was graduating. He invited his father to come from the West Bank to his graduation. The Israeli authorities, yes, said, no problem, you have a one-way ticket. If you go to Northern Ireland, you cannot come back. So that's a very practical way in which people are told, that's it.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
If I may just say this to Aninka, one of the things I'm writing about in my book is the involvement of Jewish South Africans in the anti-apartheid movement, who later on became pro-Zionist activists. And there's a lot to be answered there. Thank you very much.
That's going to be an interesting book. I want to try and bring a few things together into a question, starting with what Aninka said about the South African policy of forced removals has resulted in something irreversible. And that, to me, is why it's so concerning that these removals in Palestine shouldn't be happening, because I imagine that there's no going back on it. And so my question then is, what can we, and this is like a final question, what can we do as individuals, and what can we do as organizations? Do any of you have ideas?
I see also Roshan has a hand up, and I'm sure she has ideas about what to do.
Roshan.
Right. Thanks. No, I wanted to really thank SAJFP. I think it's been such an excellent program. And I also wanted to ask if we could use the slideshows, particularly Aninka's, as Ashes was very personal, but I think we forget, people who are old like me, the details of the way in which land was dispossessed here. And obviously it's leading up to the traditional leadership Khoisan bill, the fact that, as you were just asking the question, it becomes increasingly harder to undo that sort of apartheid, ghettoization and segregation, and the spatial geography it creates over time. But I did want to also say, encourage people to get involved with SAJFP, which is a crucial part of the South African BDS coalition. And I also wanted to to say, maybe following on from what Saleh was saying, this new push, what we're calling Israel's disaster capitalism, coming and using our water crisis as a way to get into municipalities as well as private projects in South Africa. And this most recent one, where it's via the JNF, as well as the JNF seeming to now in South Africa be suddenly re-promoting itself in various ways, whether we can look at, again, I know SAJFP's done a lot of really good work on this, looking again at ways we can raise up the whole JNF issue and challenge this, particularly where it's governments, municipalities and so on, making these partnerships. And the other thing was just to say that the BDS coalition is part of the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network that we've been establishing. And another thing, for instance, people can do right now if they're on Twitter, is tweet to Masafer Yatta, the chair of the African Union, and the African Union Twitter handle, because they've issued a statement which, fine, it's supporting the Palestinians in Gaza, blah, blah, blah. But just last year, Masafer Yatta unilaterally allowed Israel to be accredited to have observer status in the African Union. So we're tweeting to show up what a hypocrite he is and the AU is, and to kind of increase the pressure for Israel to be kicked out, which some countries, of course, are very strong on, including South Africa in that fora, but to really put the pressure on, because when you look at what's happening in Gaza and you think, these Israeli, that Israel is accredited to the African Union, it's just absurd, and awful, as well as, of course, keeping up the pressure on our government, which we need to do. First of all, to keep the language of apartheid in our government statements. And as Saleh mentioned, with the upcoming General Assembly, we've been trying to lobby, as people in SAJFP know, the ANC as well through its policy conference and the government, to make sure that it does put a resolution, and a strong resolution, around apartheid in order to demand that the Special Committee Against Apartheid is re-established. And that would be one way of pushing government towards a position on sanctions against apartheid Israel. But I'll stop there. There are many other things. People should get involved with SAJFP and find out and get active.
Thank you so much, Roshan. And I'm going to hand back now to Shireen to just end the webinar.
Thanks very much, Jessica. I think in closing, I want to obviously thank all our speakers for their input, and also to all of you who joined and took the time to listen and engage. Just listening, the more one listens to the lived experience of people in Palestine, it's just becoming increasingly impossible to deny the parallels that exist between apartheid Israel and the apartheid we experienced in South Africa. And I think we need to take up our anger and frustration and speak out where we can and get involved where possible. I think Roshan has given us some good pointers. Asha has also pointed us to some valuable resources. Please also visit SAJFP's Facebook site and get in touch with us to see how you can get more involved. So thank you to all our speakers and participants. May we see peace and justice in Palestine in our lifetimes. Okay, good night to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.